go ahead.
All right. Well, hello, everybody. As was mentioned, my name is Kristin Elton, and I'm the Program Director for the New Brunswick Invasive Species Council. And I'm going to be starting us off today in this session talking a little bit about what invasive species are, some of the background, prevention, introduce you to one that we're particularly concerned about here in New Brunswick. And then I'm going to pass it over to Steve Ginnish, who's going to talk more in depth about that species, which is the emerald ash borer, and the work that the Mi'kmaq communities are doing, and the cultural significance of ash and how this invasive species is posing a huge threat to that. So we're going to dive right in, and hopefully if there's any questions, we can we'll have time towards the end. So just a little bit of background on who we are. We're the Invasive Species Council in New Brunswick. We just try to get out there, work with all different stakeholders, different government groups, nonprofits about who are concerned with invasive species, bring everybody together so that we can create some awareness, get some action on the ground, and be collaborated and be coordinated, because that's always a way more efficient way to do things. So invasive species, for those who don't know, or who might think they know, sometimes there's some misunderstanding. So an invasive species, there's a few that you might think of when you hear that word. Giant hogweed, I'm gonna sneeze for a second. Excuse me. Giant hogweed you might have heard of as an invasive species. Asian carp is another one you might have heard of. We've got things that are interesting and kind of scary sometimes. This is actually a different one. This is sea lamprey. This isn't invasive in New Brunswick. It is in Ontario, though, in other places, and I'll touch on that in a bit. Things like lionfish, so invasive species in our marine environments. We've got small invasive species, zebra mussels, you might have heard of those. Large invasive species, like things like Burmese pythons that are invading the Everglades. Really, really tiny ones. I mentioned emerald ash borer. We'll be discussing this in a lot more detail. And then there's things that you might see on a day-to-day basis that you don't realize are invasive. So this is a European starling. It's a very common bird that has invaded North America. Interestingly, it got here because somebody who was obsessed with Shakespeare wanted to have all the birds that Shakespeare mentioned in his works in North America. So they brought a couple dozen starlings to New York City, released them in Central Park.
Mute your mic.
Oh, hello. There we go. And now there's millions of invasive starlings across the continent. There's things that are really tiny you wouldn't notice. This is hemlock woolly adelgid. It's a type of aphid that attacks hemlock trees. This is something we're concerned about showing up in New Brunswick. It is in Nova Scotia. And then there's things we brought along with us as European settlers. We did bring some other species other than humans that has had an impact. So things like European rabbits. Rabbits have had a detrimental impact on a lot of places around the world. Europeans tended to bring these as a food source. So anytime you see a wild rabbit or a bunny in your backyard, that's actually not a native species. The only native rabbits we have are snowshoe hares, and they're much larger. So what makes something invasive? Well, there's three criteria that we like to use, and something has to check off all three boxes for us to consider it to be invasive. The first is that it's non-native, meaning it didn't evolve here. It came from somewhere else, and that somewhere else could be a different continent, a different country, or it could be part of a different part of the same country. For example, Canada, something that's native on the West Coast might not be native here on the East Coast, because there is a lot of space, and the climate and habitats are very different. So if something's non-native, it also has to spread rapidly. So that's either it reproduces really quickly, like those rabbits, or once it gets into an area, it's really hard to get rid of and to control. So something with a really strong root system. And then it also has to be harmful in some way. So that's either to the environment, or it could be harmful to people, or to the economy, or to society. And when something checks off all three of those, that's when we consider it to be an invasive species. So I've got a bit of a couple examples to illustrate the differences here. So this is a plant you might be familiar with, leaves of 3, let it be. This is poison ivy. It is not an invasive species, even though we all know it can cause a reaction or a rash, but this is a native species, and you're never going to see it overgrow a forest. It is native to this area, and even though it can pose a risk, it is not an invasive species because it evolved here. Then we've got tomatoes. This is the opposite. Tomatoes are not native to North America, but as anybody who tries to grow a garden knows, you got to be really give them special care and attention for them to actually be successful. If you were to leave tomatoes to grow by themselves, they're never going to escape the garden and start reproducing because they need specific sunlight, warmth, temperatures, that kind of thing. So even though they are non-native, they're also not invasive because they don't reproduce out of control and they don't cause harm. Now, this is a questionable one. These are turkeys. New Brunswick is normally not, historically hasn't had the conditions to support turkeys on a large scale, but we are seeing some of them come up from the south through Maine. So maybe it's to do with changing climate, it's getting warmer, so these turkeys can survive our winters, but we're also seeing some people move these turkeys further into the province because they want to hunt them. Whether or not this is an invasive species kind of depends on how you view turkeys. If you love turkeys, you want to hunt them, you're going to think it's great. You're not going to think they're invasive. But if you hate turkeys because they destroy your farmers' crop fields, or they're taking over some quail habitat, something like that, you might consider them invasive because they are bad in your eyes. So invasive species are sometimes labeled based on our society's perceptions of them. So we're not really sure whether these are invasive or not. We're going to have to see what impact they have once they get here. Now, one that is not a question are zebra mussels. Zebra mussels are a tiny, tiny freshwater mussel that have invaded the Great Lakes and many other places in North America. They colonize in astronomical numbers. They cover everything. This is a native mussel that they've actually all colonized on top of, and it's preventing that mussel from opening and feeding. They get into infrastructure like pipes and power plants. They cause millions of dollars in damage. And they are kind of the poster child for invasive species. Now, this is one, it's kind of a trick question. This is cyanobacteria. A lot of people know it as blue-green algae. It's kind of a misnomer because it's not actually algae, it is a bacteria. And a lot of people think that it's invasive because we're hearing more about it, we're seeing it in more waters, but it's actually not. Cyanobacteria is something that's all around us, and the particular type of it that does cause this toxin that we're concerned about in New Brunswick is native. The reason why we're seeing more of it is simply because our climate is changing, so our waters are warming up, we're having more nutrients in the water, so the conditions are better, so we're seeing it more and more. It's not that it's moving and being spread elsewhere, it's just all of a sudden the conditions are right and we see a lot of it. Is it a problem? Yes, it's just not an invasive species problem. So I mentioned that there's impacts. There always has to be some impact from these species. So the first kind of group is to ecological impacts, like the environment. So things like competing for food and space, sunlight, other resources. So we've got a couple examples of plants here on the left side taking over areas. This is garlic mustard under the forest floor here. This is Japanese knotweed. It's a plant that's kind of like bamboo. It's actually strong enough to grow through concrete and pipes, so it causes other impacts as well. And then animals can also take up food and space. So this is a little video clip of Asian carp that I mentioned that actually you can see how many of them are actually in their water body. And they're not going to be leaving any other food or for other fish species. The other thing that invasive species can do or be is bringing new diseases, because it's not just plants and animals that can be invasive. It can also be funguses, bacteria, viruses. And a really good example, a sad example of that, is white nose syndrome, which is the fungus that grows on bats, and it has actually wiped out about 90% of our bats here in Eastern Canada. And it's thought to have gotten here through contaminated caving equipment. So somebody would have been caving or in a cave in an area of the world where it was native and it wasn't a problem because there were other things keeping it in check, got some onto their caving equipment, their shoes, ropes, that kind of thing, came to a cave in New York State somewhere. It would have transferred from that equipment into that cave. All of a sudden, it's able to spread. There's nothing keeping it in check here, and it has spread across the continent. That can happen underwater as well. This is an example of stony coral disease that's attacking different brain corals in the Caribbean, and it's thought to be transferred through people's scuba equipment. And then finally, in the environment, kind of the most widespread impact is increased predation of native species. Basically, some invasive species eat a lot of our native species. And this is a particular concern for species at risk, which are the species of plants and animals that have already have a lot of pressures and they're not doing great as it is. So when we add something else that's eating them, it really gives them a tough time. So this is just a picture. I think that is a smallmouth bass or a largemouth. You'll have to forgive me. My fish ID is not great. Eating another type of fish. Cats. Domestic cats have been a problem in a lot of places historically, and this is probably one of my favorite photos that I've seen in my work. These are two sharks, top predators in the ocean, very confused by this lionfish. They don't realize that that is food. They've never seen anything that looks like that before, so they're not going to go after that fish, and that invasive lionfish just gets a free ride to reproduce and eat whatever it wants. Now, the other group of impacts, other than to the environment, are societal. So that things to the economy, to people, to a recreation. A good example of how invasive species can impact those are things through decreasing our ecosystem services. Now, ecosystem services are just a big fancy word for basically to describe the way that the environment does things for us that are helpful. So think about wetlands that absorb a lot of water and prevent flooding. Trees in cities that provide shade and help regulate temperature, those kind of things. What happens is if an invasive species comes in and changes that environment, so say it changes all the plants in a wetland, or it eats, it destroys all the trees in a city, all of a sudden that wetland can't, hold as much water, or those trees aren't there to provide the shade. And now all of a sudden we have to put out money and try to fix that problem. Another example are impacts to infrastructure. So these are zebra mussels that are covering a boat motor. These get into everywhere. Power plants have to do maintenance, flush out all their system. That costs money. There can be human health impacts. So this is a giant hogweed plant that can cause really severe burns if you come in contact with it. And then there's things that are just impacting how we use our outdoor spaces. So this is a plant that has gotten into a waterway, and I think it's parrot feather, which is a common aquarium plant that you can put in your aquariums. But what happens is it gets in, there's nothing that eats it or controls its population, and it grows to the point where now you can't even get a boat motor through it. If that was your cottage, you'd be pretty upset. And then this is just a video that illustrates another impact. Unfortunately, that is an Asian carp that I mentioned. Those jumping carp, they jump as a response to vibrations of the boat. Multiple people have actually had head injuries and gone to the hospital with being impacted by those fish. Oh, sorry. I didn't mean to play that a second time. All right, so these are a problem. What do we do about them? We're talking about eradication. That's the big word for getting rid of them completely, or how do we control them enough so that they're not as big of a problem? There's a couple different ways to do that. One of the ways is through chemicals, so applying herbicides. Sometimes it's through manual labor, getting in there and backbreaking work, pulling out all the weeds and the invasive species. Sometimes we can hunt them or fish them if they happen to be a tasty thing. This is a TV show that they've at least have enough Burmese pythons in Florida to make 3 seasons out of. We can have really specialized equipment, costs a lot of money though. And then another way is through prevention and regulations. So regulations are the policies, the laws in place that help prevent species from getting there in the first place. And this is a picture of a zebra mussel sniffer dog. So think drug dog, bomb detection dog, search and rescue dog, but these dogs are trained just to smell out invasive mussels. And in some jurisdictions, like the provinces out west and some in the States, they have rules where if you're driving along a highway and you're towing a boat and there's a boat inspection station, you're required to pull off, and then your boat is inspected to make sure that there aren't any aquatic critters, so no mussels clinging to bits and pieces or inside the pipes. Thing is, they're really small, and we can only look so far. A dog's nose is much better. So these dogs go around, sniff out the boats. If they smell a zebra mussel, they flag their owner. That boat gets sent for decontamination, and it actually stops that boat from getting to where it was going with those zebra mussels to prevent those mussels from spreading elsewhere. But I just like this because the sign is trying to assure people not to worry. We're not looking for, drugs or weapons or alcohol. We're just looking for these invasive mussels. Now, I won't play this video because sometimes the sound gets a little laggy, but it's a really interesting description of the problem about invasives and why they can be complicated to deal with. But overall, the problem is that it can be very time consuming. So this picture on the left is actually, they're treating Japanese knotweed and they're injecting every single stem with herbicide. There can be hundreds of these stems in a patch. So that's going to take a lot of time. Sometimes they can be really expensive. These are feral hogs that are being rounded up and controlled by helicopters. Not a cheap endeavor. And then sometimes there's creative measures, things like cooking them. So lionfish, that marine invasive I mentioned, it's actually quite tasty if anybody has a chance to try it. Problem is though, not everything is tasty, and you'd have to probably eat a lot of things in order to actually keep the population down. So why is it so hard to get rid of these species then? And what can we do to try and make it easier? Well, this all comes down to the invasion curve. And it's not a scientific presentation without a graph. So this is basically the typical pattern of how an invasion happens. So we've got the amount of area that's infested on the y-axis. We've got how much it costs to control species on the other y-axis. I don't know if there's another technical math term for it. And then time is on x. So what happens is we've got the first introduction of a species. Normally, nobody notices because we're not looking for it. Nobody realizes it's not supposed to be there. So it goes along and starts to reproduce, and you've got a population start to increase. Then all of a sudden it's detected. So maybe that's accidentally. Somebody finds it and goes, hey, that looks, not really sure what that is, alerts somebody. At this point, if everybody jumped right on board and did something about it, it'd be pretty easy to get rid of. Problem is that usually doesn't happen. And the reason that doesn't happen is because there isn't a huge push from the people and the government to do anything until we start to see the impacts, the general public. So normally when it's detected, it's a single scientist, maybe a government official who's trying to, screaming at the top of their lungs that we got to do something about this. But we don't get the support behind it until the average person starts to see the impact. So things like all my trees are gone in my neighborhood, or my boat launch is completely clogged with this plant. And at that point, that's when you start to see people say, oh, we need to do something. The problem is that species population has usually grown so much by that point that it's really hard to do that. It's hard to get rid of them completely. And at that point, we usually just end up having to control. So what we want to do is try and move our response further down this curve. We want to start doing things earlier. Now, in order to do that, we want to prevent things from getting there in the first place, and create awareness about how to do that. We want to plan proactively to make sure that when something does show up, everybody knows what they have to do in order to deal with the problem. We need to have better data so that we know what those strategies should be. And overall, we need a lot of collaboration and coordination from a whole bunch of different departments, different landowner groups. Everybody needs to be on board so that when it happens, the response is really quick. And overall, it's much easier to deal with something at the beginning and prevent it from spreading than it is to deal with it once it arrives. So in order to do that, then we have to figure out, how do things spread? There's two ways. The first is naturally. These are things that are going to happen no matter what people do. So things like fish swimming, birds flying, a bird eating a berry that flies a kilometer away and poops it out. Now there's a new plant, stuff like that. The bigger problem is the way that people move these species, because humans move them further and much faster than they could on their own. So this is things like introducing a new species into the water, or releasing something into the wild, dumping your goldfish. It could be planting a plant that's known to be invasive in your garden, and it's going to escape that. The list really goes on and on. Things sticking to your boat, bugs hiding away in firewood that you move to the campsite 3 hours away. It really is, you could spend hours brainstorming these ideas. So if we know how they're spreading, the next thing we need to know is, how do we stop them from spreading that way? Because people are going to do these activities. So what we want to do is adopt behaviors that kind of prevent these hitchhiking abilities and accidentally bringing along new species, or accidentally starting a new population. So as I mentioned, there's a couple different things that you can do. So when you're hiking, we say play, clean, go. So cleaning off all the stuff on your boots. Making sure you're not moving seeds, that are stuck in your bike tires, your ATV tires from one trail to another. Everyone's taking their dog for a walk and have it come out covered in burrs, brushing those off, cleaning, draining, and drying your boat. So this is a picture here of a boat that came out of the St. John River that's covered in Eurasian water milfoil. This is a plant that spreads through fragmentation. So if you go and put this boat in the water, say, I don't know, up at Florence, Bristol, after you've taken it out at Fredericton, these pieces can fall off and grow new plants. And now you've got an invasion in Florence, Bristol. Things like egg masses that stick to things that move with us. So this is actually a folded up camp chair that has invasive egg masses stuck to it. Not dumping your goldfish. It's very common actually to see goldfish this size in places. Planting native species, knowing what you're putting in your garden, and then not moving firewood. This is one that a lot of people might have seen this messaging before when you go to a campground, because a lot of campgrounds don't allow you to bring in external firewood. And a lot of people think it's because they're trying to make money. It's actually because it's a way of preventing anything from accidentally coming in on firewood. So the firewood they sell is either cut down in the park from fallen trees, or it's been treated and heat treated to make sure that if there were any invasive pests in it, they don't survive and then accidentally spread throughout the park. So with all that, I'm going to talk a little bit and introduce one of the major species that we're concerned about here in New Brunswick, and that is the emerald ash borer. Some of you may have heard about it because it has been popping up in places more and more, the most recent being in Fredericton. So emerald ash borer is a very small beetle. It's about the size of a grain of rice. It gets its name because it is a bright emerald color. It's a beautiful bug. That specifically, we call it an ash obligate species, which means that it needs ash trees to live because it eats ash leaves, it lays its eggs on ash trees, and then the larvae, when they hatch, feed on the ash trees as part of their life cycle. Now, the problem is, in areas where they're invasive, where there's nothing controlling their population, they kill up to 99% of those ash trees that they're encountering. And unfortunately, this species is present in New Brunswick. We're seeing it more and more over the last couple of years. So the other thing to note about this beetle, it does fly, but it tends to stay fairly close from where it hatches. Usually I've read about 0.5 kilometer, but it can fly up to 10 kilometers. But on the grand scheme of things, that's not very far. This is just a diagram showing that life cycle. So to put into context, the emerald ash borer beetles lay their eggs on the ash tree. They hatch into larvae. Those larvae spend time chewing away underneath the bark of the ash tree. Then they pupate in those, what we call galleries. So they little like boreholes, canals almost under. And then in the springtime, they emerge as adults. And they do that by chewing a very distinctive hole outside of the bark, shaped like the letter D. And that's a good size comparison. It's obviously an American penny, but that's as big as they get. But the big thing is that they're killing 99% of these trees. Now, the impacts of that. So here's a picture of a stand of ash. And then here's, some of those things that I'm talking about. So we're seeing these galleries on the right-hand side here. That's what the ash borers are eating away at. Now, the problem is that it's the cambium layer. It's the part of the tree that moves water and nutrients up and down. You you damage enough of that, and the trees can't transport nutrients. There are other species, many other species that create this type of gallery under tree bark. But the problem is with emerald ash borer, there's nothing really here that eats emerald ash borer, or at least nothing that eats enough of it to keep the population down, so that too much of this gets damaged. You'll see other signs of an infestation. You'll see here, this is what we call blonding, and that's the woodpeckers know there's something under there, so they start stripping off the bark and you get this lighter coloring. And then, as I said, those D-shaped exit holes. Now, the history, they are native to China, East Asia, and Russia. They were first detected here in North America almost around the same time in Detroit and Windsor in about 2002. But based on the evidence, they looked at tree rings. They figured they'd been here since 1990s. And they're thought to have got here on packing material that was infested. This is a really good photo showing how quickly they have that impact. So this is from June 2006 on the left-hand side. This is in Ohio. And by August 2009, all those ash trees are dead. So it's very, very quick. Now here in New Brunswick, we first detected it in Edmundston in 2018. It was known to be present across the border before that, so it kind of makes sense that that's where it was first detected. But then the next year, it was detected in Oromocto and Moncton, and then the following year, it was detected in Fredericton. Now, this is an example. I'm going to quickly share my video just to show you. Hopefully everybody can still see this. This is a time lapse of the invasion. You can see it's year after year, the spread of this beetle itself. So, you know, it kind of makes sense that it's spreading kind of outwards from that main central location. For those who don't know, Windsor, Detroit is right around here. But really, it has covered a lot of ground very, very quickly. Now, this does only cover the United States. I will exit that and go back to my presentation. This has a bit more context. So, you know, as I said, the main infestation is around here. It expands. The question is, these species, we've got, you know, over here in New Brunswick, Colorado, Texas, Manitoba, those beetles aren't flying that 10 kilometers to get there. Those are being moved by people on our infested wood. So what's being done? We've got some tree removal. Sometimes when the, oh, I'm just hearing a lot of folks talking.
I don't hear anything.
Okay.
Everybody's muted, Krista.
Oh, hello?
Yeah.
I'm hearing, oh, sorry.
Everybody's muted on our end.
Okay, no, I'm sorry. I was getting multiple feeds from other things coming in. I apologize. Okay, that makes more sense. As people start talking about airplanes and stuff, I think it was a YouTube video that kept playing. All right, so where was I? What's being done about this emerald infestation? There's different techniques. Sometimes trees are removed to try and stop, you know, the available amount of food for these borers. There's regulations to stop people moving firewood, preventing, you know, trying to stop the movement, because the main way that it's spreading, particularly those large distances, for example, from Ontario to Manitoba or here, Ontario to New Brunswick, is it's coming in on ash trees that have been cut down that have larvae in them that are kind of, as I said, hitchhiking a ride here. So the regulations or rules about where you can and can't move firewood, and just to point out that you are not supposed to be moving firewood outside of these yellow areas in New Brunswick. Monitoring, so you might have seen some traps up in places. These are monitoring, they're prism traps to attract emerald ash borer if they're in the area, to get an idea of where things are before we see the impacts. And then there's also new developments in inoculating trees. So basically they're giving trees vaccines that last about 2 years to protect them from the emerald ash borer. So what can you do? You know, a lot of that happens at a bigger scale, but there's things that the average person can do as well. First is doing your part to prevent the spread. So if you're, you know, going out to your camp, or you're going to be going camping, making sure that you're buying your firewood or sourcing it as close to where you're going to burn it as possible. You know, if you cut down a tree, an ash tree, particularly at your camp or in town, don't cut it up and take it somewhere else, because it could be infested. If you're getting your a big, you know, a quart of firewood delivered, make sure that you're asking where that firewood is coming from. If you do have to move with firewood, you know, you're going somewhere, you know, you can't buy it, make sure you're buying heat treated firewood. You can buy it at different hardware stores, and also check provincial parks and national parks before you go, because some of them do have different rules. The other thing that you can do is be a citizen scientist. So a citizen scientist or a community scientist is somebody who, is the average person. You are out seeing the world, doing a lot of different stuff, and you notice a lot of things. So scientists can't be everywhere, but if you as a citizen notice something, contributing that information to somewhere helps a lot. So what you can do is learn how to identify emerald ash borer, learn how to identify ash trees and the signs of infestation, and then keep an eye out. Because as I said, with that curve, the earlier we see and find out about an infestation, the earlier you can try and do something about it. And then we also ask you to report. So if you think you have emerald ash borer, report it to your local government. You can report it to us, or you can upload it to the iNaturalist website, or an app, which is a really, really easy an app to use. And I'm just going to shout out, this is my mom actually in Ontario, who has apparently been inspecting every single ash tree she comes across. And it turned out that the one right in front of her house did have signs, and it does have emerald ash borer. Wow. Now, the reason we want this data is because better data equals better management. And what that gets down to is that we can't solve a problem unless we know what the problem is, unless we understand it. So part of solving or, preventing emerald ash borer from having an impact is knowing where it is, how quickly it's spreading. And in order to do that, we need to have better information. And scientists can't be everywhere, as I said, so the more people keeping an eye out, the better. Now, I did say, look for the signs of emerald ash borer and how to identify it. So as I said, it's a really tiny, tiny beetle. And normally you won't actually see the beetle itself. It only has an emerging flying period for a couple weeks in the summer. You're more likely to see the signs that it's there. So that includes those exit holes I mentioned, shaped like the capital letter D, the woodpecker blonding, so scraping off of that bark. If you happen to see underneath the bark, you'll see these larval galleries. Again, distinct S-shaped. That's a very distinct feature. And then you just look at the whole tree. If you know it's an ash and it looks sad, it looks sick, that's a good symptom or a good sign to look closer. Now, there are a few lookalikes for emerald ash borer. Here's a couple different scale comparisons. The one that's most commonly confused with it here in New Brunswick is various tiger beetles. They also have that beautiful emerald shiny color, but they're much bigger. You can see they've got the long legs. They kind of look more like your traditional beetle. I will say the first time I saw one of these tiger beetles, not knowing what it was before I was in the world of invasive species, I thought it might have been an emerald ash borer. So I Googled it. Fortunately, it wasn't, but it is much bigger. And so that's the main giveaway. Now, the last thing that you can do, I talked about identifying ash. I think if anybody took part in the taxonomic presentation, there's a couple key features of ash to figure out if it is an ash tree that you're looking at. The first that I use is actually the bark down here on the right. The bark kind of creates this diamond-shaped pattern. It's quite rough. Then the next thing I look at is the leaves. So ash trees have compound leaves, which means that a single leaf is made up of smaller leaflets. So this picture here is actually a whole leaf, and these little pieces are the leaflets. Think of it as being the opposite of, say, a maple tree that has that one leaf and a very, what we call a lobed leaf. So it's a single leaf, whereas this one is made up of little components. That's a pretty good sign that you're looking at an ash tree. You want to double check. You can look at if it's the right time when they've got the seeds. They've got ash tree seeds, kind of pods like, they look like paddles. So different than our maple tree seeds that kind of have those winged shapes. And then the absolute kicker guarantees you're looking at an ash is the pattern of where the branches connect. So these are opposite branching pattern, which means that every twig is going to be positioned opposite to another twig. This is different than alternate, which would be a twig and then another twig kind of staggered. So ash is always opposite like that. The other thing that you can do, there's lots of good videos. I've put a link here for how to identify ash trees. We're also asking people to keep an eye out for ash trees in the province and upload them to iNaturalist. We've got a community ash inventory project going. And although, ash aren't the invasive species, they're what we're trying to protect. So what we're asking people to do is, if you identify an ash, put it up on iNaturalist, and that way it can contribute to that data that helps us better manage and plan for how we're going to protect against emerald ash borer. Last thing is to get involved. So you can assist and volunteer with other organizations. Maybe there's an ash tree survey you want to do some monitoring for emerald ash borer, get involved with outreach, like maybe creating some social media content. Lots of different groups you can get involved with, your local governments, different watershed groups, environmental organizations. And I guarantee they'd all be very happy to have you. There's a couple more learning things there. And then I've also just thrown up our information if anybody has any questions, but for now I will pass it over to Steve.
Thank you, Kristin. I don't know if I can do it justice after what you presented there, but I'm going to try my best. Kawai, everybody. Pam, welcome for asking me to come and speak to the group again. I really find these learning from the land sessions very informative.
Great to hear you, Steve.
Everybody could see me, I think. Okay. My presentation is going to be the historical significance around First Nations and around the Mi'kmaq people with respect to ash. However, before I get started, I know Pam gave recognition to the communities and to the territories, and I take it into a little more in-depth. The organization I work for is Mi'kmaq Weltapluktahan Inc. It's a treaty right organization which brings forward knowledge in the understanding of the peace and friendship treaties as it was signed first back in 1725 through the Wabanaki Confederacy. The Wabanaki Confederacy are the First Nations, are the tribes that Pam mentioned at the beginning, be it the the Mi'kmaq people, the Passamaquoddingans, the Wooloostucks people, and one that we kind of forget sometime is the Penobscots. We don't think of the Penobscots too much, simply because the province and the society as a whole pretty well forgot about them, but they're part of the northern part of Maine, and historically came into the southwestern part of New Brunswick. Our treaties are directed and were signed based on unceded, unsurrendered land. And that's been reaffirmed in the federal courts of this land, and continue to be that way within the province of New Brunswick, and for that matter of fact, for the whole Atlantic region. If you look at the territory is virtually delineated as we reference to the Acadia Forest. The Acadia Forest, though, however, prior to the arrival of the Europeans, was called the Wabanaki Forest, and thus why the Wabanaki Confederacy, making up the tribes of the Atlantic Canada, is titled that under our treaties. As Christy mentioned in her presentation, the emerald ash borer is of great concern to a lot of us, but more so to First Nations, simply because of the fact we do see it as another species brought to our territory and will pose a great threat to our communities, both as a ceremonial reason, a spiritual reason, and also an economic reason. Basket making, as you know, most of you may know, basket making is very important to First Nation communities. And the primary source of fiber for basket making is the black ash, but also the white ash, which is used for the ribbon. And when we got wind of this beetle, I remember when I was part of the First Nation forestry program, through the Natural Resource Canada and Department of Aboriginal Affairs, got wind of this beetle making its presence in in Detroit, Michigan first, and then crossing the waterway there into Windsor, Ontario. That was back in year 2002. And I remember sitting around the table and I said, my God, here's another species that's going to have an infringement effect on our way of life. Here's another species that's going to be introduced into our economy introduced into our society, introduced into our spiritual well-being of First Nations, and it's going to be an afterthought until it became too serious or too numerous to deal with. How is it going to be dealt with? You know, we've seen it totally as another infringement on our way of life based on the commerce of this land. And how is it going to be, how are First Nations going to be accommodated or compensated for, once again, the loss of a societal aspect within our First Nations? And of course, none of those questions could be answered simply because for most cases, First Nations, in particular, Mi'kmaq, you know, the people of the Wabanaki Confederacy, it was considered an afterthought. It's no big deal. You know, it's just First Nations. And, you know, that's a standard, always been a standard approach to First Nations. However, because of the actions of First Nations since the 70s, and finally recognition as to the protection of the rights and utilization of the land within that territory, it's becoming more and more an important question to be answered by society as a whole. But also First Nations need to play a role, and First Nations need to get involved. We always cite it, we are the true stewards of the land. However, at the same time, we weren't allowed to practice that stewardship because we were left out of any management decisions, any ecological decisions, or any issues pertaining to the environment, simply because we were placed on reservations as a result of the creation of Canada. We were placed on reservations as well, just to remove us from our land in order for you know, industry and government to utilize the land for their benefits and for the settlement of this country. What's really concerning about this ash is that this particular beetle, I know in Chrissy's presentation, she mentioned the fact that it has the ability to roughly wipe out 95% of all the ash in the Eastern Canada. But we see it as a total threat, period, that it may wipe out ash, period. And all the monitoring and all the activities that are happening now are great to see. However, as she stated as well, once we notice that a beetle is present or any type of infestation is present, and we notice it as human beings, it's too late. The infestation has occurred and the infestation is ongoing. And now it's at the point where it's an uncontrollable outbreak. And we're at that point now. And what's happening right now is that, yes, it's been identified in you know, three cities within New Brunswick. That is at an urban setting. That is not on a forestry aspect or within the whole environment as a whole. Right now, there's very little monitoring happening on a forestry setting. Most of it's happening along the major thoroughways within the province. And if you see, the infestation is pretty well happening along the Trans-Canada Highway, because the biggest contributor to the movement of this beetle is, of course, us as human beings. That a beetle that normally moves 10 kilometers during its natural cycle can move up to 500 kilometers in a day if it finds its way on a pile of wood that's making it to some campsite in a different part of the, you know, province, or a different province altogether. For us as First Nations, we see this as a total infringement on a way of life. We see this as a total threat as our elders are making baskets. And I wish I had some photos to show you, but my presentations will always say, you know, go to the communities and see the quality of baskets that are being made by our people. They're astonishing. And they range anywhere from your standard work baskets, be it a potato basket, corn basket, or, you know, something like that, or a fish basket or anything like that, a standard work basket that's made very heavy and strong, to right to your fancy baskets, where they're the shape of various animals in the woods, or the shape various objects that represents a family, or represents you know, the particular maker of those baskets. And they're dyed with natural dyes that are generated from strawberries or blueberries, raspberries, and things like that. So these baskets are beautiful. These baskets have made their way around the world by people who see these baskets and realize the value and the quality of them. The baskets incorporates many aspects of the nature, be it from different plants to different animals. Like in some baskets will have quills on it, some baskets will have birch on it, and so on and so on. So these are beautiful, beautiful baskets. The baskets too are a representation of our histories, a representation of who we are as a culture, much like the snowshoes. Snowshoes were made a certain way and canoes were made a certain way by the crafter. And you can tell who those baskets were or who those crafts were made of based on the individuals who made them, because of the craft or the delicacy that's done to each piece of each item. And that craft has been handed down from generation to generation to generation. And, you know, it's great to hear that, you know, Canada and the generations that came to form this country go back 10, maybe 12 generations. But First Nations generations go back 120 years, 150 years. The latest archaeological finds in this province of New Brunswick has proven that. The latest one goes back almost 13,000 years. So, you know, yes, I'm proud when my mother talks about how many generations of her family came to this country, be it 7, 8 generations back. On my father's side, my generations go back 130 years. So you can see the connection of how First Nations are so incorporated in the natural environment, that when a species like black ash is on the verge of possibly going on an extinction level path, that concerns us really, really significantly. You know, we always hear about this great comet coming down and destroying the earth that can be an extinction level event. Well, that's happening to the black ash right now in this part of the world simply because of the emerald ash borer. Our ash is facing an extinction level event. So how can we stop this, or how can we work towards trying to at least slow down the pace until we show or can find ways in order to, you know, protect the ash for generations to come. One thing the Mi'kmaq people did is that we wanted to get involved with the monitoring because we see that as a very important thing. Because right now, Mi'kmaq territory, even though we're part of the Wabanaki Confederacy, Mi'kmaq territory is the eastern part of Atlantic Canada. We are known as the sunrise people. We see the sun sunrise before anybody else in the rest of Canada. And so the Mi'kmaq people, or even further back, Lennu is what we're actually called. Mi'kmaq is the word that came forward as the Europeans arrived, but we are Lennu historically. And knowing that, you know, we are the first people in North America to see the sunrise gives us this perspective on to what's happening to the ash tree. And we got involved in the monitoring simply because of the fact that we have to ensure that this species does not become extinct like so many other species that we see in our at this part of the world. We don't have the cougar no more. We don't have the woodland caribou no more. We don't have the wolf no more. We don't have you know, the salmon's on the verge of extinction. And that particular picture that Christy showed earlier was a striped smallmouth bass. And we all know what's happening within the Miramichi River Basin here now through Miramichi Lake, that there's an invasive species there called a smallmouth bass. And it does have the potential of wiping out, you know, the native Atlantic species. And a lot of these species were introduced simply because of individuals thought they can increase their recreational habitat activities by bringing in other species that are not native to this area, but don't realize the detrimental effect that it will have on the ecosystem as a whole. So, you know, as to the EAB, we see it as a threat to a way of life for all Mi'kmaq or all Indigenous people on the East Coast, because not only the Mi'kmaq practice basket making, so does the Passamaquoddingans, and so does the Willisticks people. How do we protect it? I mentioned that a second ago. How can we try to ensure that we do not see the extinction of the ash trees? First of all is monitoring. There's no beetle yet present on the East Coast, simply because of the fact that we don't have the major thoroughways here, in our opinion. So we want to watch to see if any beetle was going to show up in this area. So we end up training individuals from all our 9 communities in New Brunswick to recognize what this beetle looks like. It's very characteristic with respect to what does an ash tree look like when it's infected, and participate in that monitoring. So we end up placing traps within the 9 communities. Unfortunately for this year, we haven't seen any beetle. However, that monitoring will continue because we know eventually it's probably going to present itself here. We hope it doesn't, but that's kind of wishful thinking. And, the presence of this beetle has other effects. It is being considered to be listed on the species at risk list. And of course, once that happens, there's another infringement aspect to First Nation communities, because once it's listed, it also has the potential of removing access of black ash from anybody's uses. We are talking to the various organizations and the various government officials of how we can ensure that the ash, really as it pertains to craft making and basket making, ain't interrupted for First Nation communities, and what could be done to ensure that that doesn't happen. As well, we are talking to industry and government, since a lot of the ash trees that were harvested during regular harvesting operations are normally not utilized as heavily commercially, that those ash trees be made available to First Nation communities, and the protocols necessary to ensure that those trees are not infected, and that the transportation of infected trees do not occur within First Nation territory. So, that's occurring as well. The thing is for us is now how to preserve the species itself, how to ensure that my grandchildren and the grandchildren of their grandchildren and so on will still be able to practice the craft of basket making, can still be able to have a small economy from basket making, because a lot of the First Nation economies were ripped from us. Society as a whole don't realize that First Nations, maybe we were lacking the right to copyright and patent various products, but things like snowshoes, things like canoes, things like products like maple syrup and all that, that was all brought to society as a whole by First Nation people. And economically, First Nation people never benefited from that, simply because of the policies and directives directed at us as communities by government, and the restrictions put on First Nations to actually build their economies were so strong up until the 70s, that it's only now in present day that First Nations are finally getting a voice and finally building an economy, and were perceived as threats by industry and government, when finally we have the abilities to start building our economies. We see it in the actions of provincial governments and industry all too often to keep the First Nations down. But that ain't going to be that's First Nations ain't going to allow that to happen anymore, simply because of the fact that we need to prosper on our own land, as well as everybody else profit and prospers from the land of which the treaties have allowed for society as a whole to do that. As one of the things that we're trying to do with in ensuring that the species of black ash is here for generations to come, we do have partners with the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, Natural Resources Canada, and Department of Environment and Resource Development, to collect the seeds, save the seeds, and find a meaningful way to store those seeds, because the the viability of seeds vary over time. Seeds are only viable for a certain amount of time, and black ash trees usually don't survive. Black ash seeds usually don't survive for a very long period of time. You might get 50 to 100 years out of them, but if we're talking about a beetle here that can be here for generation, and most likely needs to eat themselves out of house and home first before we can repropagate the species, there's a concern of how long we can store those seeds in order to reintroduce black ash to the forest and to the environment as a whole once this beetle has kind of passed. This beetle ain't going to be gone in a matter of a couple of years. This beetle's here as we see it for generations to come. You know, there is hope that it ain't going to wipe out all the ash trees, but yet we have to see if through research or through IC and through Western science, if that's actually going to be the case. But in the meantime, we can't wait to see if those type of questions are going to be asked. We have to come up with solutions now in order to ensure that you know, the species survives. What also needs to be done is that, as I stated earlier, monitoring is only related to the urban area, the residential areas, or the major streets, or the major routes, or the highways coming through you know, this province. We need to find a way where actual forest monitoring can happen, forestry inventory can happen. Identify the black ash trees that are in, because black ash does not occur like every other stand of products out there. You can't go out and find a black ash stand like you can a spruce stand or a maple stand or a cedar stand. These particular species of trees are scattered among those trees. They are associated with certain slopes, be it on the, you know, the south side of slopes, within water courses, close to you know, wetlands, and also kind of associated with eastern white cedar. So, you know, the more people out there doing this type of monitoring and identifying ash trees within their vicinities, within their woodlots, or within their private lands, or within the industrial freehold, will help build the inventory of this province in order to identify where these ash trees are. Now, a lot of the ash trees ain't conducive to doing basket making within First Nations, so it does take a particular ash tree of particular form and diameter and that to actually create a basket. And so even though there may be plenty of ash trees there now, the beetle is threatening them. So how many of the good quality ash trees are going to be taken out by this beetle? And will there be any ash trees left that could actually make baskets afterwards? You see the big ash trees that are in the, you know, the cities and towns, those are way too large to make baskets out of. And so, you know, the first question that comes to First Nations, any of the trees to harvest, can you use the ash tree? No, we can't, because it's not the right quality of ash that we're looking for. So you got that factor into making baskets as well, is that you know, you can't make a hockey stick out of a tree that's real crooked and got a lot of knots in it. It's the same thing with basket making. But yet historically, the hockey stick was made out of ash tree, or a white ash tree, or a hickory tree. A lot of the baseball bats used in the major leagues are made out of a white ash and stuff like that. So it is a very, very sought after species. So how do we collectively protect that? How do we ensure that this beetle does not wipe out every ash in this world? Because right now, as far as First Nation sees it, it is an extinction level event happening as it pertains to the ash tree. So I'll leave my remarks at that. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me. And thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Steve Wallalin. I'm going to stop